In this lesson, we're going to talk about percents. So, first, I want to brainstorm places that you see percents in everyday life. So, I've put some here, but I want you to be thinking about some other examples that you may remember. So, often you'll see things on sale. So, 50% off or 75% off. Here's a big sale of all different types of percents off. Here we see a label from some sort of food that's 100% natural. These over here are ones that you may see in your life more. We all want our phones to be at 100% when all the bars are full. That means it's as charged as it can be, 100%. And over here, this guy's phone is not all the way full, so it's not quite 100%. That might be 75% full. Here, when we take tests, that's a great example of when we see a test. If you get them all right, that's 100%. If you don't get them all right, then you might get a 90%. And finally here, you might recognize this from IXL. I cut this from IXL because this is where when I assign you and I say you only have to get to 80%, or sometimes I say you need to get to 100%. So this is another place where you see percents. And you know from doing this that when I ask you to get to 100%, that means you have to complete the whole IXL. When I just ask you to get to 80%, you don't have to complete the whole thing, just part of it. So with that in mind, let's take a look at what exactly is a percent. So a percent, the word percent means part of 100 or out of 100. And this little sign right here is the symbol we use for percent. So when you think about the word per means part of, the word cent means 100. So think about the word century. That means 100 years. Or if you think about centennial, that's a celebration of 100 years. Or even cents, like cents on a dollar. There's 100 cents in a dollar. So the word cent means 100. So a percent is another way of writing a part of a whole. So when you think of the expression part of a whole, that should remind you of what we have learned before called fractions. So a percent is another way to write a fraction. So let's review all the ways that we know how to write a fraction that we've learned this year. So let's use the example 75 out of 100. We know that that can be written as a ratio, 75 out of 100. We've also learned that that can be written as a fraction, like this, 75 over 100. And in the last couple of chapters, we've been talking about how a fraction can be written as a decimal. So 75 over 100 can also be written as 75 hundredths. So a percent is a fourth way that we can write a fraction. So all of these things right here, all four of them, represent the same thing. It's just a different way to write 75 out of 100. Four different ways to do that. So today we're going to focus on the percent. So let's look at this illustration. Here we have 100 little squares. And remember, each of these columns represents 10 squares. So one little square is 1 out of 100. So if we're looking at this would be, it's asking how many parts out of 100 are shaded. So if I count them up, that's 10, 20, 30, 48. So that's 48 parts out of 100 are shaded. So I can write that as 48 over 100. I can write that as a fraction. And what we're learning today is that 48 over 100 means 48%. So the key with the percent, again, remember that cent, percent means out of 100. So the key is we need the denominator to be 100 in order to change it to a percent. So 48 over 100 means 48% of the large square is shaded. So then let's talk about how much is not shaded. So all of these white squares that aren't shaded, there's 52 of those. And I can get that by counting up the white squares and getting 52, or I can say, all right, I know the whole big square is 100 little squares, and 100 minus 48 would give me 52. So 52 over 100 means 52% of the large square is not shaded. Okay, so let's look at some more examples. So these are some examples that you're going to see in your workbook pages. So this says 56 hundredths. And if you remember from what we learned before, we can write 56 hundredths as 56 over 100. And once we get 56 over 100, remember that key denominator, it has to be 100 in order to change it to a percent. We know that 56 over 100 is 56%. So we've just changed a decimal into a percent. Okay, so let's look at this one. This one's a little bit different. This decimal reads 9/10. Remember, it just has one decimal place, so that's tenths. So 9/10. But when we want to find the percent, our denominator has to be 100. So you say to yourself, what can I do to this to get an equivalent fraction with 100 as the denominator? So I say, what can I multiply by 10 to get 100? And that would be 10. So if I multiply the bottom by 10, that means I also have to multiply the numerator by 10. So that would give me 90 over 100. And once I have a denominator of 100, I can change it to a percent. So that would be 90%. So again, it's very important. You first have to get your denominator to be 100, then change it to a percent. Okay, so take a minute to do these four, and then come back and start the video again and see how you did. All right, so this is 17 over 100, so it would be 17%. This is 68 over 100, so that's going to be 68%. 53 over 100 would be 53%. And 82 over 100 is going to be 82%. Again, these are all over 100, so you can change those directly to a percent. So here it's asking you to go the opposite way. They give you the percent, and they want you to change it into a fraction, and then we'll go ahead and change it into a decimal too. So 71% means 71 over 100. Okay, so there it is as a fraction. And we know how to change this into a decimal. We know that 71 over 100 means 71 hundredths. So I can write that as 0.71. So these three things all mean the same thing. They're just written in a different way. All right, same here. 2% means 2 over 100. Now, if I want to write that as a decimal, that is 2 hundredths. So be really careful when you do that. We're writing 200ths. So I'm going to say 0.02. Because remember, when we're writing hundredths, we have to have 2 decimal places. It wouldn't be decimal 2 because that would be 2/10. What we're trying to write is 200ths. So it would be decimal 0.2. Now, another thing to note is if I wanted to leave this as a fraction, this fraction can be reduced. I can divide both the numerator and denominator by 2, and that would give me 1/50th. So that is another way to write this. I can write this fraction in simplest form, which would be 1/50th. And 1/50th means 200ths, which means 2%. Okay. So here I have created a chart, and you can fill this in with me, of some popular percentages. And these are percentages that you just need to commit to memory. These just need to be almost like your multiplication tables. Like you just need to know these because these are ones that you see a lot in your everyday life. So I've created this chart and we're going to talk about it and fill it out together. So we're going to start with 10%. So to write 10% as fraction, that would be 10 over 100. And that can simplify to 1/10. We can write that as a decimal as 10 hundredths. Or remember, that's the same thing as dropping that 0 off, because remember that 0 doesn't really change the value. So that's also equal to 1/10, which is what we have written here. And if we were going to shade it in, we would just shade in this one little piece right here. So you can see that 1/10 is a little small piece of the whole. Okay, another popular one you'll see is 25%. So what I want you to remember is that 25% means 25 over 100, which means decimal 25, 25 hundredths, which is the same as 1/4. So I want you to remember that 1/4 is the same thing as 25%. It's a quarter of the whole. So if you think about like a dollar, if you have 25 cents, that's 1/4 of the dollar because 4 quarters make a dollar. Okay, 50%, that's a real popular one. 50% is 1/2. So if it's 50% off, you're just going to pay half price. And we know that because it's 50 over 100, which reduces to 1/2. And we can write that as 0.5, decimal 5, or decimal 50. Remember, these are the same thing. This would be 50 hundredths is the same thing as 5/10. 1/2. All right, 75% is another one you'll see a lot. 75% is the same thing as 3/4. So 75 over 100, we can write that as a decimal as 75 hundredths, and that's 3/4. So again, think of it as a dollar. If you have 3 quarters, then that's 75 cents. Okay, and finally, one that you already know is 100%. 100% is written 100 over 100, which is 1. That would, if we reduced that, we would have 1 over 1, which is 1. So 100% is one whole. If you get 100% on your test, that means you got them all right. If your phone is charged to 100%, that means it's charged completely, as much as it can be. So 100% means the whole thing. One whole. Okay, few more examples that you're going to see in your classwork. We just got to think a little bit. There's an extra step involved, but it's the same thing that we've already been talking about. So here we're given fractions that don't have 100 in the denominator. But lucky for us, we have a way of finding equivalent fractions so that we can get 100 in the denominator. So if you remember, we did this when we were changing fractions like this into decimals. And I told you to look at the denominator and see if there's anything you can multiply it to get 10, 100, or 1,000 to change it to a decimal. But we have to remember with percents, it has to be 100 in the denominator. So we're looking at these and saying, is there anything I can multiply by 20 to get 100 in the denominator? And that would be 5. So if I multiply 20 by 5, that's going to give me 100 in my denominator. And if I multiply 3 by 5, remember, whatever I do to the denominator, I have to do to the numerator. That gives me 15. So now I've changed this fraction into an equivalent fraction of 15 over 100. And what that does for me is now my denominator is 100, so I can change this to 15%. So what that means is 3/20 written as a percent is 15%. Okay, here's 4/5. So take a minute and go ahead and do these last two. See if you can figure these out and then come back and see how you did. Check it with me. Okay, so I'm saying to myself, what can I multiply by 5 to get to 100? And that would be 20. So if I multiply the bottom by 20, I've also got to multiply the top by 20. So that's going to give me 80 over 100. And once I have it over 100, I can easily change it to 80%. So what that means is 4/5 written as a percent is 80%. Okay, now this one's a little bit different because here we have 200. So I'm thinking to myself, what could I do to that to get it to 100? It's over 100, so I'm going to need to divide because I need it to get down to 100. So what can I divide 200 by to get it to 100? Well, if I divide it by 2, then that would get it to 100. But if I divide the bottom by 2, I've also got to divide the numerator by 2. So I'm going to divide numerator and denominator by 2. So 200 divided by 2 is 100. And then 78 divided by 2 is 39. So now I have 39 over 100. So I can change that to 39%. So 78 over 200 is equal to 39%. So another way to look at this too is 4/5 means 4 out of 5. So 4 is 80% of 5. Or 78 is 39% of 200. Just another way to think about it. So those are all ways that we can convert fractions to decimals to percents.